I was born on this land. My hands learned to work the soil before they learned to write. The smell of wet clay, the hum of crickets after the rain, the sound of the wind brushing through the corn, all of it felt like God's own language. My father used to say, "The land speaks, son, but only those who listen with faith can hear what it says." For years, I believed him. Every harvest felt like a hymn, every sunrise a promise. But that year, the song stopped. The sky, which once blessed our crops, turned against us. The rain vanished for months. The ground cracked open like an old wound, and the cattle began to die one by one. When the rain finally came, it didn't bring mercy, it brought destruction. In 3 nights, everything I had built washed away. The fences broke like matchsticks. The chicken coops floated down the hill. My father's barn collapsed under the weight of the storm, and the fields, my pride, my future, disappeared under brown, rushing water. When the storm ended, I walked through what was left. The air smelled of mud and death. I looked around and couldn't recognize the place that had raised me. The land that once gave me life was now silent, and I, a man who had always spoken with God, felt that he had gone quiet too. I sat on the steps of my ruined porch and stared into the distance. I wanted to pray, but the words wouldn't come. You ever felt that? When you want to cry out to God, but all that comes out is silence? That night, my silence was my prayer. The wind began to blow again, rising from the valley. It wasn't the gentle evening breeze I knew so well. It was cold, strange. It carried weight, as if the whole earth was mourning with me. I whispered into the darkness, "Why, Lord? I gave you my days, my harvests, my praise. Why did you let this happen?" The wind passed again, brushing against my face, and right there, in the sound of the leaves, I heard something I couldn't explain. Not with my ears, but deep in my soul. A whisper, soft, but steady. "I'm still here." I froze. It didn't come from outside. It came from within. For a moment, time stood still. The air around me felt alive, and the ache in my chest loosened just enough for me to breathe again. "I'm still here." That phrase stayed with me like an ember in the ashes. The next morning I walked the property. The mud was drying and the sun peeked through the clouds for the first time in days. I kicked through broken boards, torn wire, and soaked soil. And there, in the middle of the wreckage, stood one wooden post from the old corral, still upright, holding a small weathered sign. It was something my father had carved years ago. The letters were faint, but clear enough to read, "The Lord of the harvest never sleeps." I fell to my knees, and for the first time since the flood, I cried, not out of anger, but out of surrender. Those tears didn't feel like defeat. They felt like faith being reborn. It's strange how pain can break something open inside us so that grace can finally flow in. That night I sat on the porch again. The moon hung low and the air was still. I closed my eyes, and once more the wind rose. It wasn't fierce this time. It moved softly, almost like a hand resting on my shoulder. Inside I heard the same words again, clear and calm. "I'm still here." I don't know if you've ever felt that. That quiet moment when you realize God never left. When you stop asking why and start hearing still. The storm had taken everything I could touch. But in losing it all, I found something I couldn't see. The breath of God, moving unseen, whispering life into what looked dead. I didn't know it yet, but that whisper would follow me. Through the rebuilding, through the doubt, through the days when the sky stayed gray and the earth stayed silent. And that same breath that once blew down my barn was going to lift my faith back up again. So let me ask you something. Have you ever stood in the ruins of something you loved, your home, your dream, your heart, and still felt that faint whisper inside saying, "I'm still here"? If you have, then you know what I mean when I say this story isn't just about a field. It's about every soul that's been broken and waited for God to breathe again. And friend, the breath is coming. The days that followed the flood felt endless. The sky stayed gray, heavy, like it was mourning with me. The air smelled of decay, of something sacred that had been broken. Every time I stepped outside, the silence pressed against my chest, thick and alive. It wasn't just the land that had drowned. It was my hope, too. The once green fields were a wasteland. Where there had been life, now there was mud and shattered wood. Even the birds, my faithful company at dawn, were gone. You ever walked through a place that used to sing, and now it's just quiet? That kind of silence hurts more than noise ever could. One morning, I went out to see what little could be saved. The earth squished beneath my boots, soft like wet ashes. I picked up a broken hoe, half buried in the mud, and sighed. How am I supposed to start again, Lord? There's nothing left. Then, from somewhere near the back of the property, I heard it. A faint, delicate sound. Not the storm, not the wind. It was the trickle of running water. I followed the sound until I reached the far end of the land, and there it was, a thin stream of crystal water flowing from between two stones. I froze. That shouldn't be possible. The old spring had dried up years ago. My father used to pray by it, saying, "When this spring flows again, it'll be a sign that God hasn't forgotten this place." My knees hit the ground before I even realized it. I cupped the water in my hands, cold, clear, alive. Tears blurred my vision. It felt like the earth itself was crying with me, but this time the tears brought life. I whispered through trembling lips, "Lord, the field is weeping, but you're giving it voice." Maybe you felt that before. That moment when everything is broken, but God sends a small sign, just big enough to say, "Don't give up yet." If you've ever been there, write it in the comments. I've seen God in the small things. Because sometimes, it's not the thunder that proves He's near. It's the whisper of water in a dry place. Later that afternoon, I heard someone calling my name. It was my neighbor, Mr. Arlindo, a man with silver hair and kind eyes. He came walking up the dirt road, hat in hand, mud on his boots. He said, "I heard about what happened, Josué. Came to see if you needed a hand." I hesitated. Pride's a tricky thing. I didn't want to look weak, not even after losing everything. "I'll be fine, Mr. Arlindo," I said. "God will help me." He smiled, that patient kind of smile that only older men have. "Son, who do you think sent me?" I didn't have an answer. He put a hand on my shoulder. Sometimes, God doesn't shout from heaven. Sometimes, He knocks on your door with muddy boots. That night, His words wouldn't leave my mind. As I lay in bed, the crickets returned, faint but steady. And somewhere outside, the wind moved through the trees again. It wasn't loud this time. It was gentle, like breathing. Maybe that's what faith sounds like when it's reborn. Quiet, but alive. The next morning, I took my old hoe and went back to work. The ground was soft and damp from the new stream, so I started to dig. Each strike of the blade against the soil felt like a heartbeat. My muscles ached, but it was a good ache, the ache of someone who still believes. As I worked, the wind rose, circling me. It pushed the clouds aside just enough for the sun to shine through.
The golden light fell across the mud, and I swear for a second the whole field seemed to breathe. I stopped and whispered, "You really are here, aren't you?" The air shifted again, and deep inside, that same voice, that same whisper I'd heard the night of the storm, spoke once more. "Yes, Josué, I'm still here." I leaned on my hoe and laughed, half in disbelief, half in joy, because at that moment I realized something. The field wasn't the only thing being restored. God was rebuilding me too. By the end of that week, help started coming from everywhere. A man from the next village brought tools. Another family dropped off bags of seed. A woman from church showed up every day with food, and every time I thanked them, they said the same thing. We just felt like we were supposed to come. That's when I knew. The wind that spoke to me was whispering to others, too. It wasn't just about my land anymore. God was weaving something bigger, a story that started in the mud but would grow roots of faith across the valley. And that tiny spring of water that had appeared in the backfield, it kept flowing. Never stronger, never weaker, just steady, like grace itself. Have you ever seen something small become a miracle in your life? Write it down below. I've seen grace flow. Because in the next part, the same wind that comforted me will start performing miracles no one could explain.
On the third week after the flood, the land stopped feeling like a graveyard and started feeling like a question. The mud no longer swallowed my boots. It yielded. The trickle at the back of the property kept singing, thin and stubborn. And the wind, more than anything, the wind behaved like it knew me. It came in moods. Some mornings it brushed past my face like a blessing, soft as a hand on a fevered brow. Other hours it pressed against my shoulders, urging me forward when I wanted to lie down and quit. And whenever doubt crawled back into my chest, the wind arrived the way a father enters a room, quiet, sure, not asking permission to comfort his child. I was in the yard one hot afternoon, wrestling with an old plow the current had twisted like wire. Rust had eaten the joints. The handle bit into my palm. I slammed the tool down and groaned, "What's the use, Lord? I don't even know where to start." That's when the gust rose from the low field, swept the mango leaves into a spiral, and threw a spray of dust across my boots. In that rush, no louder than a breath, I heard it. Not through my ears, through my ribs. Plant anyway. I straightened. The words felt absurd. Plant what? In this? With what seed? With what time? But the way the sentence sat inside me, calm, relentless, meant it wasn't a suggestion. It was instruction. So I obeyed the only way I knew. With small steps. I found the last sack of beans a neighbor had dropped off, damp around the edges but salvageable. I picked a patch where the soil felt firm, turned the earth with a shovel, and laid the seeds into their beds like children into blankets. Nothing proud about it, nothing heroic, just obedience with dirt under the nails. If you've ever done something that made no sense except that God said so, you understand the strange courage that follows. Tell me in the comments if you do. I obeyed before I understood. Sometimes faith looks less like fireworks and more like an old man planting beans in bad weather. 2 days later, Mr. Arlindo returned with 2 men I'd never met. One carried a toolbox, the other lumber on his shoulder. "We're here to raise your shed," Arlindo said, as plain as naming the time. I tried to protest. Pride still limps even after you repent. But he waved me off. Last night I couldn't sleep. Kept hearing the same thing. Go back. He'll need more than seed. So we're back. We worked until the sun burned the sweat white on our shirts. Hammers spoke in rhythms. Sawdust clung to our lashes. All afternoon the wind moved through the frame, testing each crossbeam, fluttering the fresh-cut edges like the pages of a book. When the last board stood and we stepped back, a hush fell. Then a gentler draft slipped through the rafters, and the loose end of a tin sheet chimed 3 soft notes, almost like a hymn. I didn't say a word, neither did they. Sometimes gratitude steals language before it gives it back. That night I slept, but not deep. The wind tapped softly at the shutters as if to say, "Come outside." I walked onto the porch and sat. Moonlight laid a silver road across the newborn stream. What do you want from me, Lord? If you're rebuilding the field, what are you rebuilding me for? This time the wind didn't speak in sentences. It gathered around me. Yes, that's what it felt like, gathering. And I understood something without hearing it. God wasn't only restoring my land, He was restoring my usefulness. He would make my small place a shelter for others while their faith found its footing. The next morning proved it true. A pickup I didn't recognize turned up the lane loaded with tools. Behind it, a cart with seedlings. Behind that, a woman from a church across the river with pots of food. None of them had coordinated, yet they arrived within minutes of each other, stepping down with the same phrase on their lips. We felt led to come. I nearly laughed. Led by what? By whom? I wanted to call down the hill, "Do you hear him too?" But I let the wind answer for me, combing the grass in one direction, like a guiding finger. We built fences, cleared debris, and ran a shallow channel from the stream to a cistern. Around noon, when the heat bent the horizon, we stopped to pray. No one nominated me to lead, but my knees hit dirt and the words rose clean. Thank you for showing up in people. Thank you for making the wind a messenger. Keep us listening. When I lifted my head, I found tears on more than my own face. That week, rumors began to move faster than trucks. Folks started calling my place the field that listens. Some came out of curiosity, others because they needed the kind of hope that can be pointed to. I told each of them the same simple truth. I heard God in the wind, and I obeyed. That's it. The miracle is His. The beans are just beans. Still, the signs multiplied. The patch I planted, late, poorly with doubtful hands, pushed up green faster than any reasonable season could explain. By the 5th dawn, pairs of leaves had unfurled across the rows like 100 tiny prayers, answering at once. The stream never surged and never slowed. It just kept running, as if it had always been there. Bees, absent for weeks, found the flowers on the hedges. A hawk nested again in the tall eucalyptus. Creation knows when its keeper is near. One afternoon, an agronomist from the co-op walked the length of the property, boots sinking slightly, jotting in a notebook. At the spring he knelt, stared hard, and scratched his head. This basin's dry everywhere else, yours shouldn't be flowing. Yet here we are. He looked at me like a student waiting for a better teacher. I shrugged and smiled. Maybe the map doesn't include the wind. But the turning point, the moment that moved the story from private to public, came the following Saturday. The little church down the road invited everyone for an evening service under the open windows. The sanctuary smelled like pine soap and wax, the pews worn smooth by faithful backs. We filled the place, farmers with dust in our hair, kids with grass stains on their knees, widows whose prayers hold up rafters. Halfway through the pastor's message on endurance, the wind rose outside.
Trees leaned toward the building, leaves trembling. A few of us glanced at the doors, remembering storms. "Lord, not again," I breathed. But this wind stepped inside, like a friend. It entered warm, not roaring, resting. The curtains lifted without tangling, the candle flames bent but did not go out. A cool rush slipped along the floor and climbed our chests, like the first breath after grief. Nobody spoke. Nobody had to. Every head tilted, every spine straightened. And within that shared stillness, a phrase settled across the room. No voice, yet unmistakable. The way sunlight has no tongue and still announces itself. I'm still here. Some fell to their knees. Others raised their hands. I stood frozen, tears salting the corners of my mouth, not from shock anymore, but from recognition. Moments later, the wind eased gently out the doors. As it did, rain began. Not a hard, angry downpour, the kind that bruises crops, but a steady, cleansing fall. We spilled from the church laughing and weeping as the dust turned to dark earth beneath our feet. The pastor lifted his face and whispered, "Thank you for showing up in people. Thank you for making the wind a messenger. Keep us listening." That night I laid awake, listening to the roof sing under the rain. You weren't just saving my field. You were gathering a people. The wind eased through the open window and brushed my cheek like an answer. Friend, if you've ever wondered whether God still speaks, hear me. He does. He speaks in Scripture, in saints, in silence, and sometimes in the wind that tells a stubborn farmer to plant beans out of season. If that stirs something in you, write it below. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Because in the next part, what the wind started as a whisper will become a miracle no one in our valley can ignore.
Weeks passed, and the valley began to whisper again. The cicadas returned first, then the birds, then the laughter of children running between the fences we had rebuilt. But what filled the air most clearly was the wind, alive, playful, always arriving right when doubt began to settle. Every morning I would walk the length of the new rows of beans, my boots sinking lightly into the damp soil. The plants were too green for the season, too strong for the little I'd done. Their leaves turned toward the breeze like faces toward a voice they recognized, and the stream kept flowing, not drying, not flooding, just steady, as if the land itself had found its rhythm again. One dawn before the sun crested the hills, I rose early to pray by the spring. Mist floated over the water. When I knelt, I felt the wind circle me, warm and bright. The world was utterly still except for that soft pulse of air, and in it, something like laughter, not mocking, but joyful. "You see, Josué," the whisper seemed to say, "life was never gone, it was waiting." That morning, I wept openly, not for what had been lost, but for everything that still lived. Sometimes tears are not grief anymore, they are recognition. By midday, people began showing up again. A group of farmers from 2 towns away, drawn by stories that something strange was happening here. They stepped out of the trucks and stood quietly, watching the breeze ripple across the field like an invisible hand stroking the earth. One man finally said, "It looks like it's breathing." I smiled. It is. The field's alive again. That night we gathered at the little church for another service. The building could barely hold the crowd. Old men who hadn't prayed in years came with their hats in hand. Children leaned against their mothers, eyes wide. And as the pastor read from the book of Job, he makes the wind his messenger, a hush fell. Outside, the air shifted. Then, just like before, the wind entered. Not a gust this time, but a breath, soft, fragrant, full of warmth. It moved through the sanctuary, stirring the hair on our arms, carrying a peace so thick it made the candles flicker without going out. I heard sobs around me, quiet, reverent. The pastor stopped mid-sentence, and in that stillness we all felt the same thing, though none of us could describe it later. A voice without sound, saying the same words I had heard the night of the storm. I'm still here. A woman near the front dropped to her knees, weeping. An old farmer whispered, "He's speaking." Children reached out their hands as if to touch the wind itself. Then the windows burst open, not violently but wide, and a wave of cool air swept through the room, rolling like a tide of light. At that exact moment, the heavens broke open and rain began to fall outside. It wasn't the kind of rain that destroys. It was gentle, rhythmic, soaking the dry ground that had cracked for miles. The congregation rushed out under the eaves, laughing, crying, lifting their faces to the downpour. The dust melted into life before our eyes. I stood there, barefoot in the mud, arms open. The water soaked my clothes, and the wind wrapped around me like a cloak. And all I could whisper was, "Thank you." That night, long after everyone had gone home, I sat alone on the porch. The rain had stopped. Moonlight shimmered on the puddles across the field. The air smelled of wet grass and something holy. I realized then that the miracle wasn't the water or the crop or the voices that had filled the church. The miracle was presence. God showing himself not in lightning or thunder, but in a whisper that refused to fade. The same God who spoke from a storm to Job, from a bush to Moses, from a whisper to Elijah, had spoken to a simple farmer who had nothing left to lose. And in that realization, I understood. Faith isn't about seeing God fix everything, it's about knowing he never left in the first place. The wind sighed through the open door, brushing past my shoulder. I smiled. I hear you, Lord. If you've ever felt God turn your silence into peace, write it in the comments. He's still here. Because in the final part, the miracle won't stay in one field. It will spread through the entire valley.
Months slipped quietly over the valley, and the scars of the storm became the soil of a new season. The air smelled of grass again. Cattle grazed where the mud had once swallowed fences. Children chased each other along the dirt road, their laughter rising like birds that had waited for the wind to return. From my porch I could see it all, the field alive, the river glittering in the distance, the mountains breathing in blue and gold. It looked nothing like the wasteland I remembered, but I could still feel the echo of that dark day when I thought God had gone silent. The difference now was that silence no longer frightened me. I knew who filled it. People began calling this place the Field of the Wind. At first I laughed it off, embarrassed by the attention. But then visitors started coming. Pastors, farmers, even people who didn't believe but wanted to see the field that listens. They didn't come for the crops. They came for the peace that seemed to hover over the land. And every time someone stepped onto this soil, the breeze would rise gently, brushing across their faces like a greeting. I never said it aloud, but I knew. He was welcoming them himself. When the harvest season came, I didn't measure the yield by weight or profit. I measured it by gratitude. The beans grew full, the grain strong, and the stream that had once been a trickle now flowed wide enough to water neighboring farms. What had started as one man's whisper with God had become provision for an entire valley. The church decided to hold a Thanksgiving service in the field itself. We cleared a space near the stream, set up benches, and strung simple lights between poles. As dusk settled, people arrived from miles away. Families in old pickup trucks, elders in worn Sunday clothes, children carrying candles in jars. The air pulsed with the hum of life and expectation. When the pastor asked me to speak, I almost said no. I was no preacher, no scholar, just a man who had learned how to listen. But as I stood in front of that crowd, the words came like rain after drought. I lost everything here, and I thought that meant God had left. But I've learned something I'll never forget. When the wind of God blows, it doesn't come to take. It comes to plant.
And what he plants, no storm can uproot. For a long moment no one spoke, then an old woman started to clap softly. Others joined. Before long the entire field echoed with applause and weeping, and as if on cue, the wind stirred. It rolled through the crops, bending them like waves, wrapping around us in a slow, holy dance. The lights swayed above our heads. Children raised their hands, laughing. I closed my eyes. The wind carried the scent of rain, of earth, of heaven. And somewhere within it, I heard it again, the same words that had carried me from despair to life. I'm still here. I fell to my knees not out of weakness, but in awe, because now I understood he had never left, not even in the flood, not even when my prayers were only silence. He was in the waiting, in the rebuilding, in the smallest breath that moved the leaves. When the night ended, people lingered. Some filled jars of water from the spring. Others took a handful of soil. It feels different here, lighter. I smiled. That's what happens when a place remembers the voice that made it. Weeks later, I walked alone through the field. The harvest was over, the land resting. A soft breeze moved through the dry stalks, and the sound reminded me of 1,000 quiet prayers being answered. I thought about how far I'd come, from the man who cursed the sky to the one who could now hear God in every breath of air. Thank you, I whispered, for not leaving when I stopped listening. The wind lifted the hem of my shirt, gentle as a friend's hand on my back. And in that moment, I didn't need visions, signs, or miracles. I just needed that presence, invisible but undeniable. The same spirit that once hovered over chaos, now resting on this little piece of earth, reminding me that life begins again where faith dares to listen. So if you ever find yourself standing in ruins, if your home, your dream, your heart has fallen quiet, step outside. Listen. Feel the air move against your face. Because maybe, just maybe, it's not just the wind. Maybe it's God saying to you what he said to me on the day the sky closed. I'm still here.